This is Candle and Coffin. Let's uncover the forgotten truth beneath the ashes of history. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this story travels in the waning centuries of the late Bronze Age. The world was an intricate tapestry of kingdoms woven with threads of iron ambition, shifting alliances, and the relentless hunger for dominion. Among these powers rose the Hittite Empire, an empire of stone and shadow nestled in the rugged heart of Anatolia, where chariots thundered across sun-scorched plains, and kings sat beneath banners embroidered with the sigils of gods and war. Their cities, massive and fortified, echoed with the clamor of artisans, scribes, and soldiers, crafting an empire that rivaled Egypt and Assyria in wealth and might. Yet, beneath this veneer of power, fissures began to crack. A network of political rivalries, resource scarcities, and shifting trade routes whispered of instability. The Hittites had faced enemies before. Their military prowess was legendary, their diplomacy cunning, but nothing prepared them for the storm that brewed beyond their borders. An unforgiving tempest of natural disasters, invasions, and internal strife that would unravel their world in a single, brutal winter. What dark confluence of fate and folly could dissolve a civilization so entrenched, so seemingly eternal? Was it the blade of foreign swords, the hunger of a restless populace, or the betrayal of those sworn to protect the throne? As the sun set on the Bronze Age, the Hittite Empire did not simply fall, it vanished, swallowed by time and dust, leaving behind cryptic ruins and fragmented tablets that speak of a twilight shrouded in mystery and despair. Tonight, we trace the shadows of a forgotten empire, walking through the echoes of battlefields drenched in blood and the silent corridors of palaces, abandoned overnight, to ask the question that history left unanswered. How does an empire disappear so swiftly, leaving no voice to mourn its passing? This is a journey through ruin and resilience, power and collapse. A story not just of an empire lost, but of humanity's fragile grasp on greatness. The Hittite Empire, at its zenith, was a marvel of ancient statecraft, an intricate web of city-states, vassal kingdoms, and formidable fortresses stretching across Anatolia and into the Levant, bridging the worlds of East and West. Its capital, Hattusa, crowned with towering stone walls etched with mysterious hieroglyphs and adorned with colossal lion statues, was a symbol of unyielding might and divine favor, a place where kings claimed the mandate of the storm god Tarhan himself. These kings were not mere figureheads, but warrior priests, strategists, and diplomats, navigating a treacherous landscape of alliances and betrayals, marriage pacts, and wars. The Hittites wielded iron with a mastery that gave them a technological, edgerly iron smelting that whispered the future age of metal. But even this advantage could not shield them from the gathering darkness. As decades rolled into centuries, the empire's foundations began to erode beneath the weight of growing threats. The restless sea peoples pressing from the Mediterranean coasts, famine creeping over the land like a slow poison, and the fracturing of once loyal vassal states yearning for independence. The economy, built on trade routes threaded through hostile deserts and mountainous passes, faltered as banditry surged and rival kingdoms seized control. Meanwhile, within Hattusa's labyrinthine palace chambers, court intrigues festered like hidden wounds, noble families vying for power, spies weaving webs of suspicion, and priests murmuring omens of doom. The very gods who once smiled upon the Hittite kings now seemed distant and silent, as if the heavens themselves were turning their backs on the empire's fate. How does an empire, carved from stone and steel, unravel when the invisible threads of trust, loyalty, and faith begin to fray? The answer lies in the crucible of that final winter, when the land froze not just with cold, but with the death knell of a civilization. A season that would witness the crumbling of walls, the silencing of drums, and the vanishing of an empire overnight. Amidst the crumbling edifice of power, the Hittite kings struggled to hold the fraying threads of their realm, but history's cruel tides showed no mercy. Suppiluliuma II, the last known monarch, ruled a kingdom teetering on the brink. A ruler whose inscriptions echo with defiance and desperation, warning of enemies at the gates. In the fading favor of the gods, the written records, painstakingly etched on clay tablets, reveal an empire beset not only by external invasions but by a profound internal collapse. Famine stalked the land, the granaries ran low, and once bustling cities like Hattusa and Hattusa faced abandonment. As their people fled starvation and fear, the military, once a finely tuned engine of conquest and defense, faltered under the weight of stretched supply lines and fractured command. Chariots that had once thundered victoriously across battlefields now became silent relics of a forgotten age. In the shadow of these crises, vassal states such as Ugarit and Alashia rebelled or fell to foreign powers, fracturing the empire's backbone. As coastal cities burned and trade routes collapsed, the Hittite world shrank like a dying ember, its light dimming in the encroaching darkness. Yet, what most haunts this story is not just the violence of conquest or the cruelty of famine. It is the mystery of the disappearance. Unlike other great civilizations, the Hittites left no grand obituary, no final lament carved in stone. Instead, they vanished from the scrolls of history as if swallowed by the earth itself, leaving behind ruins haunted by silence and questions that echo across millennia. Was it the relentless onslaught of the sea peoples that crushed them? Did the land betray them with drought and famine? Or did internal betrayal, political treachery, and social collapse ignite the empire's final blaze? The truth is buried in fragmented tablets and scattered ruins, a puzzle waiting to be pieced together by the sharpest minds and the boldest storytellers. Tonight, we sift through the ashes, seeking not only the story of a lost empire but the haunting lesson of how power, no matter how mighty, can crumble overnight. As famine gnawed at the bones of the empire, the social fabric began to tear apart, leaving communities fractured and desperate. Farmers who once tilled fertile lands now face parched fields and empty granaries, their pleas drowned beneath the rising tide of chaos. Refugees poured into the cities, swelling the ranks of the destitute and straining the fragile infrastructure of the Hittite heartland. The ruling elite, long insulated by walls of stone and privilege, found their authority slipping like sand through clenched fists. The palace scribes' once orderly annals turned fragmented, bearing the scars of hurried dispatches and frantic warnings each tablet, a testament to a world unraveling. Religious ceremonies, which had woven the empire's identity and unity, faltered as priests grappled with omens of disaster, their voices trembling beneath the weight of impending doom. Meanwhile, the common people whispered fears of the sea peoples, enigmatic marauders who swept in like a storm from the western seas, burning coastal cities and severing trade lifelines. Whether these invaders were the final nail in the coffin or merely harbingers of a deeper malaise remains a question that haunts historians. Adding to the turmoil were earthquakes that shattered city walls and disrupted agriculture, further compounding the empire's woes. The landscape itself seemed to rebel against its inhabitants, as if nature conspired with human folly to bring down a kingdom that had dared to reach for the heavens. Yet, amid the chaos, some pockets of resistance flickered. Local governors attempted to hold their territories, and warriors fought desperately to keep invaders at bay, but these efforts were fragmented and ultimately futile. The once unified Hittite Empire fractured into isolated shards, each left to fend for itself as the central authority crumbled like ancient stone beneath relentless waves. This unraveling was not a sudden lightning strike, but a slow, inexorable winter, a bitter season that swept through the land and extinguished the flame of a civilization that had burned bright for centuries. The question remains, how does a world so vast, so complex, simply vanish overnight? What forces, both seen and unseen, conspired in that fateful season to erase the Hittites from history's grand stage? The geopolitical tremors that shook the late Bronze Age world echoed through the corridors of Hattusa, where emissaries and envoys carried grim news from distant lands. The fragile alliances that had once bound the Hittite Empire to neighboring powers frayed under the strain of mistrust and desperation. Egypt, the great rival to the south, watched with wary eyes as chaos unfolded, while the rising power of Assyria cast long shadows from the east, eager to fill any void left by the crumbling empire. Trade routes that once pulsed with the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture now lay choked by warbands and marauders, severing the lifeblood of Hittite prosperity. The famous Treaty of Kadesh, a symbol of diplomatic triumph between the Hittites and Egyptians decades earlier, now felt like a distant memory. Its promises rendered hollow amid the gathering storm. In the streets of Hattusa, whispers turned to cries as food grew scarce and hope faded. Soldiers, once disciplined and loyal, grew restless and mutinous, their steel dulled by hunger and despair. Meanwhile, royal families engaged in bitter power struggles, each faction grasping for the throne like a drowning man clutching driftwood, even as the empire itself sank beneath the waves of catastrophe. Among these shadows moved the enigmatic sea peoples, a coalition of seafarers and warriors from the Aegean and Mediterranean who descended with fire and fury, their origins and motives shrouded in mystery. They struck coastal cities with devastating precision, cutting off access to vital resources and trade, and sowed terror like a plague. Whether these invaders were the final cause of collapse, or simply opportunists exploiting a dying beast, their impact was undeniable. As cities burned and populations scattered, the Hittite Empire's vast expanse fractured into isolated pockets of resistance and despair, each struggling to survive in a world that had turned against them. The silence that followed was deafening. A world without the roar of chariots, without the clang of swords, without the pulse of a mighty empire that had once ruled Anatolia with iron will. The night fell, and with it, the Hittites vanished, not with a final battle cry, but with a whisper lost to the winds of history. Amid the smoldering ruins of their once great cities, the survivors of the Hittite collapse faced a harsh new reality, a world stripped of order and drowned in uncertainty. Families torn from their ancestral homes wandered through desolate landscapes, their footsteps swallowed by dust and silence. Refugee caravans trailed across barren fields, carrying what little they could salvage: fragments of pottery, sacred relics, scraps of scrolls bearing prayers for a salvation that never came. The social hierarchy that had bound kings to priests, nobles to commoners, dissolved as survival became the sole imperative. In these desperate days, ancient bonds of loyalty fractured, replaced by suspicion and self-preservation. The oral traditions of the Hittites, once a proud chronicle of conquest and piety, faded as elders passed away, their stories unrecorded and soon forgotten. What remained was the cold stone of abandoned temples, the shattered idols of gods once worshipped with fervor, now lying broken beneath a darkened sky. Scholars today sift through these silent witnesses, piecing together a narrative that hints at a civilization consumed not only by external forces, but by the weight of internal collapse, famine that starved the body, and political decay that starved the soul. Yet, amidst the ruin, glimmers of resilience flickered. Some displaced groups merged with neighboring peoples, their bloodlines and customs seeping into new cultures, ensuring that while the Hittite Empire vanished, its spirit lived on in unexpected forms. This fusion of peoples blurred the lines between conqueror and conquered, rewriting the map of the ancient Near East. The empire's fall was not just an end, but a transformation, a phoenix rising from ashes scattered by the winds of catastrophe. But still, the haunting question remains: what precise combination of forces, natural disaster, invasion, betrayal, or systemic failure turned a titan into dust overnight? The story of the Hittites is not merely one of demise, but a profound meditation on the fragility of civilization, the thin line separating order from chaos, and the echoes left behind when an empire's heartbeat suddenly stops. As the dust settled over the Hittite heartland, the vacuum left behind became a battlefield for emerging powers and restless peoples hungry to claim the spoils. The collapse rippled far beyond Anatolia, shaking the foundations of the entire late Bronze Age world. New kingdoms rose from the ruins, but none could recapture the grandeur or stability once wielded by the Hittite kings. Assyria, with its iron-fisted ambitions, capitalized on the chaos, expanding relentlessly into former Hittite territories, carving a new empire with blood and steel. The coastal city-states, ravaged by the sea peoples and bereft of Hittite protection, struggled to rebuild amid a shifting geopolitical landscape. Trade networks, once the arteries of cultural and economic exchange, fractured into isolated veins, slowing the pulse of civilization itself. This era, known as the Bronze Age collapse, was a period of dark uncertainty. Cities burned, writing disappeared, and whole cultures slipped into obscurity. The Hittites were not alone in their vanishing act, but their disappearance remains one of the most mysterious and impactful. Archaeologists and historians, piecing together tablets and ruins, have uncovered tantalizing hints of droughts, earthquakes, and invasions that converge in a perfect storm of destruction. The sudden silence left in their wake invites endless questions. Was this a divine punishment, as priests of the time might have claimed, a failure of leadership and vision, or an unstoppable cascade of environmental catastrophe combined with relentless human conflict? The fragmented remains of the empire tell a story of resilience and ruin, a stark reminder of how the mightiest can fall, sometimes without a single battle cry, but with the cold, final quiet of extinction. Through these ruins, the spirit of the Hittites lingers, an echo of power and pride, lost dreams, and the fragile, fleeting nature of empire itself. Beneath the rubble of Hattusa, the once vibrant capital now silent and forsaken, archaeologists unearthed the ghosts of a civilization frozen in time-collapsed walls, scorched temples, and tablets cracked by fire and time. Their cuneiform inscriptions whispering stories of desperation and final defiance. These artifacts, scattered like breadcrumbs through the ruins, reveal a society caught in the grip of catastrophe, struggling against forces beyond their control. The clay tablets speak of famine that ravaged fields and livestock, of battles lost to unknown enemies, and of kings who cursed the heavens for their silence. Yet these records are fragmented, like the shattered mirrors of a once glorious empire reflecting only glimpses of the whole. This patchwork history forces us to read between the lines, to imagine the faces behind the ink, the farmers starving in their fields, the soldiers defending crumbling walls, the priests performing rituals to appease angry gods, and the rulers grappling with the collapse of everything they had built. The disappearance of the Hittite script from the historical record marks not just the fall of an empire but the eclipse of a language and culture. Swallowed by the tides of time and conquest, the legacy of the Hittites thus became a ghost story, whispered in the margins of history, rediscovered only millennia later by scholars piecing together the past from its broken remnants. The sudden vanishing challenges our understanding of resilience and fragility, forcing us to confront the brutal reality that even the mightiest civilizations can be undone by a combination of war, famine, and natural disaster. As we stand in the shadow of their ruins, we glimpse the haunting truth. History is not a steady march of progress, but a cycle of rise and fall, of empires built and broken, sometimes in the blink of an eye. The sudden silence of the Hittite Empire rippled through the ancient world, sending shock waves that reshaped the balance of power across the Near East. Neighboring kingdoms, some erstwhile allies, others bitter rivals, scrambled to fill the void left by the vanished Titan. The Assyrians, relentless and brutal, seized the opportunity to expand their dominion, tightening their grip on former Hittite territories with iron will and military precision. To the south, Egypt grappled with its own internal turmoil, unable to capitalize fully on the chaos, while smaller states in the Levant and Anatolia carved out fragile existences amid the ruins. This geopolitical fragmentation ushered in an era historians call the Dark Age, marked by a decline in literacy, monumental architecture, and centralized governance. The cultural and economic networks that had once flourished under Hittite patronage dissolved, leaving a patchwork of isolated communities struggling to survive in a harsher, more uncertain world. Yet, despite the seeming collapse, the legacy of the Hittites seeped into the fabric of successor civilizations, their laws, military innovations, and religious practices leaving subtle imprints on the cultures that followed. This paradox disappearance, paired with lasting influence, adds a layer of tragic complexity to their story, a reminder that even in death, an empire's shadow can stretch across centuries. As we peer through the veil of time, piecing together fragments of clay and stone, we confront the enduring enigma. How could such a powerful state, so deeply woven into the political and cultural tapestry of its age, simply vanish overnight? The answer lies tangled in the interplay of human ambition, environmental upheaval, and the relentless forces of history, a stark testament to the fragile and fleeting nature of power beneath the surface of history's grand narrative lies the intimate human story of those who lived through the collapse, the farmers, soldiers, priests, and rulers whose lives were shattered as their world turned to ash. Imagine a young Hittite soldier, eyes wide with the terror of a battle lost to invaders. He barely understands. A priest trembling as the sacred fires falter, and the gods seem deaf to desperate prayers. A mother clutching her starving child as famine ravages the land once rich with grain. Their voices are lost to time, but through the fragments of tablets and ruins, we catch glimpses of their pain and resilience. The collapse wasn't merely a military defeat or political failure, it was a profound social trauma that ruptured the very identity of a people. Families were uprooted, traditions forgotten, and the sacred bonds that held communities together unraveled in the cold shadow of death and displacement. This human cost echoes through history, reminding us that behind the sweeping tides of empire are individual stories of survival, loss, and hope. The vanishing of the Hittite Empire overnight was not just the fall of stone walls or the extinguishing of royal flames, it was the fracturing of a civilization's soul, scattered across new lands and generations. As we piece together their story, we honor those forgotten lives, bearing witness to their struggles and the fragile thread of humanity that persisted amid collapse. Their legacy, though buried beneath centuries of dust, challenges us to reflect on the resilience of the human spirit and the price of power lost too soon. In the wake of the empire's sudden silence, the land itself seemed to mourn, as if nature had turned its gaze away in sorrow or anger. Geological evidence hints at a series of devastating earthquakes that shook Anatolia to its core, crumbling walls that had stood for centuries and opening fissures that swallowed entire villages. These seismic upheavals compounded the suffering, wrought by famine and invasion, tearing apart the very earth that sustained the Hittite people. The crops, already faltering under drought and overuse, withered beneath the unrelenting sun, and rivers once abundant ran dry or changed course, disrupting irrigation systems that fed the population. Climate shifts played an insidious role. Tree rings and sediment layers tell a story of extended droughts coinciding with the empire's final years, a natural catastrophe that no amount of political maneuvering or military might could stave off. These environmental disasters did not just erode the physical landscape, they fractured the social and political structures built upon it, shaking the foundations of faith and authority. Priests and kings, once seen as mediators between gods and men, found their power questioned as divine protection seemed to falter. The Hittite collapse thus stands at the crossroads of human fragility and cosmic indifference, a testament to how even the grandest civilizations are vulnerable to the caprices of nature. It was a brutal reminder that history is not only shaped by human ambition, but by the relentless forces of the natural world, indifferent to the dreams and despair of those who dwell beneath its shadow. As the earth cracked and skies darkened, the political core of the Hittite Empire began to fracture beyond repair, with regional governors and military commanders seizing power amid the chaos, turning what had once been a tightly controlled realm into a patchwork of feuding fiefdoms. Loyalty to the central throne, once absolute, gave way to self-preservation and ambition. As each leader fortified their own cities, hoarding resources and recruiting private armies. This fragmentation invited endless conflict. Former allies became bitter enemies in a desperate scramble to survive. These internecine wars drained the remaining strength of the empire, as blood spilled on both sides of shattered walls and fractured fields. Meanwhile, the Sea People's relentless raids from the Mediterranean coast only worsened the turmoil, cutting off vital access to trade and reinforcements, and striking fear into the hearts of a population already on the brink as alliances crumbled and desperation spread. The very identity of the Hittite state eroded, no longer a unified empire, but a collection of isolated strongholds clinging to memories of former glory. The royal lineage itself grew uncertain, with competing claimants and assassinations muddying the line of succession and deepening the political abyss through this maelstrom. The once proud kings faded into obscurity, their names lost or obscured. In fragmented records, their decrees ignored or impossible to enforce. This disintegration reflects a larger truth about empire building, that the fragile architecture of centralized authority can collapse when confronted by simultaneous pressures of external invasion, environmental disaster, and internal strife. The Hittite story is a tragic illustration of this fragile balance, a cautionary tale of how power, no matter how monumental, can dissolve overnight into chaos and ruin. In the empire's twilight, the capital city of Hattusa stood as a ghost. Of its former self, its colossal gates still carved with lions and gods, but now opening the streets where grass sprouted between stones and silence hung heavier than the summer heat. The archives, once overflowing with clay tablets recording treaties, harvests, and royal decrees, grew dusty and abandoned, their scribes gone or dead. Markets that once bustled with merchants from distant lands now lay empty, save for a few desperate traders hawking the last remnants of bronze tools, woolen cloaks, and pottery. Even the great temples, where priests once burned incense to honor the storm god and sun goddess, fell quiet as offerings ceased and the god's favor was believed to have departed. Rumors spread like wildfire that the royal family had fled to some distant refuge, that the gods had turned their backs, that the end was not just near, but already upon them. Outside the city walls, rural communities fared no better. Farms lay abandoned, and entire villages simply vanished from the record, swallowed by famine, disease, or migration. It was not a single decisive battle that ended the Hittite Empire, but a slow, suffocating erosion of every pillar that had held it upright: political authority, religious faith, military strength, and economic vitality, all crumbling in grim unison. When the final blow came, whether from invading armies or the last starving riots within, no chronicler was left to record it. Hattusa disappeared into the dust, and with it, the heartbeat of a civilization that had once ruled the highlands of Anatolia like a colossus. For centuries, its memory lay buried, waiting for a future age to rediscover its broken stones and forgotten kings. When the Hittites vanished from history, it was not with the cataclysmic roar of a great empire's fall, but with the chilling quiet of a candle snuffed out in a darkened hall, leaving surrounding kingdoms baffled and uneasy. To Egypt, once their rival and uneasy ally, the silence from Anatolia was both a relief and a warning, relief that no Hittite armies would again march through Syria, and warning that some force, unknown and perhaps unstoppable, could erase a power so mighty. Mesopotamian scribes, meticulous in their records, began to write of the lands of the northwest in vague and uncertain terms, as if their knowledge had slipped into shadow. Greek Mycenaeans, who once traded with the Hittites, left no detailed lament, only the subtle absence of their name in lists where it had once stood proudly. Archaeological layers from this period tell the story better than any ancient writer could. Chart beams from burned palaces, layers of ash, scattered skeletons, and, above all, the abrupt halt of an entire writing system as cuneiform tablets ceased to be inscribed for the ancient world. This disappearance was not merely a geopolitical shift. It was a tear in the fabric of the known order, proof that even God's anointed kings could be swallowed by forces beyond mortal control. The shockwaves of the Hittite collapse rippled through the late Bronze Age, contributing to the unraveling of interconnected trade routes, alliances, and cultural exchanges that had bound the Eastern Mediterranean together for centuries. In the void they left behind, smaller kingdoms and ambitious warlords scrambled to seize territory, but none could claim the same mantle of empire. The highlands of Anatolia, once the beating heart of Hittite power, became a realm of scattered hillforts and forgotten names, their stones whispering only to the wind. In the wake of Hattusa's desolation, the Hittite people did not vanish entirely. They fragmented, splintering into smaller kingdoms and tribal enclaves that clung stubbornly to the highlands and valleys of Anatolia and northern Syria. These Neo-Hittite states skirmished, melted, Tabal were pale reflections of the old empire, but they carried within them the embers of its culture, language, and gods. Their kings still claimed descent from the great Hittite monarchs, even as their palaces were smaller, their armies leaner, and their reach limited. Stone reliefs in these cities bore the same proud imagery of chariots, feasting lords, and divine blessings, though now carved with a touch of local flair, blending Hittite traditions with Aramean and Phoenician influences. In this fractured landscape, diplomacy and survival replaced the grand strategies of empire. Alliances were forged not to dominate the region, but simply to keep the wolves at bay. Whether those wolves came in the form of Assyrian expansion or local rivals, traders from these successor states still moved goods along the old routes, carrying timber, metals, and textiles. But the era of great imperial caravans was gone. In their oral traditions and temple rites, the Neo-Hittites preserved echoes of their past glory, yet the memory grew fainter with each generation. To later civilizations, they would be little more than footnotes, strange mountain kings and fortified towns, clinging to the vestiges of a fallen world. And yet, in their persistence, they offered a final, quiet defiance against the tide of history, a refusal to be wholly erased. The Neo-Hittite states, scattered and vulnerable, soon found themselves caught in the path of the Assyrian war machine, a force that moved with the precision of a blade and the inevitability of a storm. At first, these small kingdoms negotiated, sending tribute and gifts in the hope of preserving autonomy. Gold, timber, and even daughters were offered to placate the Assyrian kings. But tribute only postponed the inevitable. The Assyrians, relentless in their expansion, pushed deeper into Anatolia and Syria, annexing cities and installing governors in place of native kings. Fortresses that had once withstood centuries of war now fell within weeks to siege towers and battering rams, their walls reduced to rubble beneath the roar of Assyrian iron. Carved stone reliefs from Nineveh depict the conquest and merciless. Detail Hittite captives marched in chains, their cities burning behind them, their once proud banners trampled into the dirt in the Assyrian records. These campaigns are written not as the destruction of a proud culture, but as the rightful punishment of rebels and tribute defaulters. Yet beneath the propaganda lies the unvarnished truth. The last threads of the Hittite tapestry were being ripped away, city by city, king by king. By the late 8th century BC, the Neo-Hittite states had vanished from the political map, absorbed into the sprawling Assyrian Empire. What remained of their identity lived only in the stones of their ruined cities, and in the faint traces of their language whispered by a dwindling few. And with each passing decade, even those echoes grew quieter as the world moved on, forgetting the hands that once held the scepter over half of the ancient Near East. For centuries after their disappearance, the Hittites existed only as faint shadows in the annals of their former rivals, brief mentions in Egyptian inscriptions, passing references in Assyrian chronicles, and scattered allusions in the Hebrew Bible. To the peoples who inherited their lands, they were simply the ones who came before, their true name and grandeur already eroding under the sands of time. The massive fortifications of Hattusa became little more than stone quarries for villagers. Its once sacred temple stripped bare of gold, copper, and carved reliefs, clay tablets, carefully pressed with cuneiform script detailing royal edicts and epic battles, lay buried in the dust, their stories sealed away in a language no one alive could read. Myths blurred with memory, and over generations, the Hittites transformed in the collective imagination from an empire to a vague, half-forgotten tribe, another casualty of the Bronze Age's mysterious and violent end. By the time of the classical Greek historians, the Hittites had vanished so completely from the historical record that their very existence was doubted. The great kings who once dictated the politics of the Near East were now ghosts, their names unknown, their deeds unwritten, their monuments wuthering under the indifferent sky. It was as though an entire civilization had slipped into the cracks of time, waiting patiently, silently for someone, somewhere, to remember. It was the late 19th century, and Europe's obsession with the ancient Near East was in full swing. Explorers, scholars, and treasure hunters scoured the Middle East in search of the cities named in the Bible and the forgotten powers of the Bronze Age. In 1834, a French explorer named Charles Texier stumbled upon the sprawling ruins of Hattusa in central Anatolia. What he saw: massive stone gates, sprawling foundations, and strange relief carvings defied easy explanation. This was clearly no small outpost. It was the capital of an unknown empire, yet Texier could not identify its builders. Decades later, the first clay tablets began to surface from these ruins, covered in cuneiform but in a script unlike any that had been seen before for decades. The script resisted all attempts to read it, taunting scholars with its silence. Slowly, however, through patient study and comparison, linguists realized they were looking at something unprecedented, an Indo-European language written in cuneiform. By the early 20th century, the work of Czech scholar Bedřich Hrozný cracked the code, revealing that these tablets spoke of kings, treaties, gods, and wars of a mighty empire the Hittites long thought to be no more than a biblical footnote. The silence of 3,000 years was broken, and the Hittites stepped back into history not as shadows, but as a civilization whose reach had once stretched across continents. Once the name Hittite was spoken again with certainty, the pieces began to fall into place. Excavations at Hattusa and other sites like Yatsokaya culled deep and covered layer upon layer of history, royal archives with thousands of clay tablets, city walls stretching for kilometers, stone lions guarding ancient gates, and sanctuaries carved into rock where the gods of the storm and the sun once received offerings. These finds revealed an empire that had ruled with both iron and diplomacy, signing the world's first known peace treaty with Egypt, commanding armies that clashed with Ramses II, and governing through a complex system of law and administration. What emerged was not a footnote in someone else's history, but a dominant power that had once stood shoulder to shoulder with the great civilizations of its age. And yet, as scholars pieced together the empire's past, they were haunted by a question that still burns unanswered today. How could something so vast, so organized, so deeply rooted in its world, vanish in a single generation? The mystery of this sudden collapse continues to captivate, a reminder that history is never as permanent as it pretends to be. And so, the Hittites return not in the flesh, but in the minds of those who dig through time's ruins and try to hear the voices of the long dead. The story of the Hittites ends not with a bang we can hear, but with an echo we can feel. One moment they were their commanding armies, negotiating treaties, raising temples to their storm gods, and in what seems like the blink of history's eye, they were gone. Their cities fell silent, their records buried, their name nearly erased. And yet, their fingerprints remain in the laws they wrote, the treaties they signed, the art they carved, the words they spoke that now breathe again through the cracked lines of clay tablets. The Hittites are a reminder that no matter how mighty an empire seems, time is always waiting, patient and merciless. They also stand as proof that nothing is truly lost, not as long as someone remembers, searches, and tells the story anew. So here we are, 3,000 years later, speaking their name again. And if this tale moved you, if it made you see the shadows of the past walking beside us, then carry their story forward. Like the stone lions at Hattusa's gates, let it guard against our forgetting. History does not belong to the past alone.